The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, amber glow over the city streets. Tricia Newman tightened her grip on her tote bag as she walked briskly toward her car, parked a few blocks from her office. She had just finished a productive day at the nonprofit organization she worked for, where she'd been organizing an event on community police relations. It was a topic close to her heart, born out of her own family's experiences and her unwavering commitment to justice. The city's familiar hum surrounded her, the distant honking of horns, snippets of conversations, and the rhythmic clatter of her heels on the pavement. Tricia felt a fleeting sense of accomplishment as she mentally reviewed the day's achievements. The event was less than a week away, and everything was falling into place. But as she rounded the corner to where her car was parked, she noticed something that made her pause. A patrol car was idling nearby, its engine humming softly. Tricia's heart sank slightly. The officers inside seemed to be watching her, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted windows. She tried to shrug off the unease, telling herself it was nothing, and quickened her pace. Reaching her car, she unlocked the door and tossed her bag onto the passenger seat. She was about to climb in when she heard the sharp crackle of a police radio. "Ma'am, can you step away from the vehicle?" The voice startled her. She turned to see two officers approaching, their expressions unreadable. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his badge catching the fading sunlight. The other was younger, his posture less confident, but his eyes followed Tricia intently. "Is there a problem, officers?" Tricia asked, keeping her tone calm. "We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area," the taller officer said. His name tag read Lynch. "We need to ask you a few questions." Tricia's pulse quickened. "Suspicious person," she repeated, trying to mask her irritation. "I'm just leaving work." Officer Lynch raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "We'll need to see some ID." Her mind raced. She knew her rights, but refusing wasn't an option she was willing to consider. Slowly, she retrieved her wallet and handed over her driver's license. Lynch examined it for what felt like an eternity before passing it to his partner. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Lynch asked, his tone casual but probing. "I work a few blocks away," Tricia said, her voice steady despite her growing unease. "At the community center." Lynch's eyes narrowed. "The community center, huh? What kind of work do you do there?" Tricia hesitated. She didn't owe them an explanation, but the tension in the air was palpable. "I organize programs," she said finally. "Educational events, workshops, things like that." The younger officer glanced at Lynch, who smirked slightly. "Educational events," Lynch echoed. "Like what?" "Like fostering better understanding between the community and law enforcement," Tricia said, her patience thinning. She could see where this was headed, and it infuriated her. Lynch's smirk widened. "Interesting," he said, handing back her license. "You wouldn't mind if we take a look in your car, would you?" Tricia stiffened. "Actually, I would," she said firmly. "I know my rights, and unless you have probable cause." "Probable cause," Lynch interrupted, his tone mocking. "Look, we're just doing our job. If you've got nothing to hide, there's no reason to make this difficult." Tricia met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Am I being detained?" Lynch's smirk faltered, replaced by a cold glare. "Not yet," he said, his voice laced with warning. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Tricia and Lynch. "Maybe we should just let her go," he muttered, but Lynch ignored him. "Step aside, ma'am," Lynch said, his hand hovering near his utility belt. "We're going to take a look." Tricia's heart pounded as she stepped back. She wanted to protest, to call out the blatant abuse of power, but she knew it wouldn't help. Instead, she stood silently as they rummaged through her car, their movements deliberate and invasive. When they found nothing of interest, Lynch's frustration was evident. He slammed the glove compartment shut and turned to Tricia with a sneer. "What's this?" he asked, holding up a stack of flyers she had printed for the upcoming event. Tricia swallowed hard. "It's for an event we're hosting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lynch studied the flyer, his eyes narrowing. "Looks like you're stirring up trouble," he said, tossing it onto the seat. "Maybe you should think twice about poking your nose where it doesn't belong." The threat was thinly veiled, and Tricia felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "Are we done here?" she asked, her voice firm. Lynch's smirk returned. "For now," he said. "But don't go far. We'll be keeping an eye on you." As they walked away, Tricia climbed into her car, her hands trembling. She sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The encounter was over, but the humiliation and anger lingered. Driving home, Tricia replayed the incident in her mind, each detail stoking the fire of her resolve. She couldn't let this slide. Not this time. The next morning, she began documenting everything. The officers' names, their actions, their words. She filed a formal complaint with the department, knowing full well it might go nowhere. But she wasn't about to stay silent. Her complaint set off a chain of events she couldn't have anticipated. Calls from reporters. Messages of support from colleagues. And, inevitably, the backlash. It started subtly, her car being towed for violations that didn't exist, anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Then came the outright intimidation, a patrol car parked outside her apartment for hours at a time, its occupants watching her every move. Tricia refused to be deterred. She reached out to a civil rights organization, sharing her story and the details of her work. Together, they began building a case, not just against the officers who harassed her, but against the culture of bias and abuse that enabled them. But the fight was far from over. The forces aligned against her were powerful, and the deeper she dug, the more dangerous the opposition became. The days following Tricia's formal complaint were marked by a tense unease that followed her like a shadow. At first, it was subtle, a lingering patrol car on her block, the unmistakable sensation of being watched when she walked to her office. Tricia told herself it was paranoia, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But when she spotted the same black and white cruiser circling her building multiple times in a single evening, her suspicion solidified. She kept her blinds closed and her doors locked, but the unease seeped into her daily routine. The next morning, as she arrived at the community center, she noticed something strange. A man in plain clothes was loitering near the entrance, pretending to read a newspaper. He glanced up when she walked past, his eyes sharp and calculating. Inside, her colleague Maria was already at her desk, sorting through stacks of paperwork. Tricia leaned against the doorframe, forcing a smile. "Busy morning?" Tricia asked, trying to sound casual. Maria glanced up, sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" "There's a man outside," Tricia said, lowering her voice. "I think he's watching the building." Maria frowned and stood, peeking through the window. "He's not familiar. Should we call someone?" Tricia hesitated. "I don't want to jump to conclusions. It could just be a coincidence." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. That afternoon, while she was leading a workshop with a group of teens, Tricia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it at first, focusing on the discussion about community leadership. When the session ended and the teens filed out, she checked her phone. The message was from an unknown number: "You're making a mistake. Drop the complaint." Her breath caught in her throat. The words were blunt, the threat unmistakable. She showed the message to Maria, who immediately urged her to report it. "This is serious, Tricia," Maria said, her voice trembling with concern. "You can't ignore it." Tricia nodded, but a sense of dread weighed heavily on her. Reporting the text felt like tossing a stone into a dark, unpredictable void. She forwarded the message to her lawyer, who assured her they would include it in the case file. But Tricia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into a game where the rules were stacked against her. 2 nights later, Tricia woke to the sound of shattering glass. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and crept toward the living room. The sight stopped her cold. Her front window was smashed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. On the coffee table lay a brick with a note attached to it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The message was scrawled in bold, aggressive letters, "Keep quiet." She called the police, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. But when the officers arrived, their response only deepened her frustration. "This could have been a random act of vandalism," one of them said, shrugging as he scribbled in his notepad. Tricia clenched her fists. Random? The note was a direct threat. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We'll file a report, but there's not much we can do without evidence." Their indifference stung, but it wasn't surprising. Tricia felt the weight of their unspoken message, "Don't expect us to help." The next morning, Tricia sat in a meeting with her lawyer, Mr. Stein, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind. He listened intently as she recounted the events of the past few days, his pen moving swiftly across a legal pad. "This is escalating," Stein said, adjusting his glasses. "We need to take additional precautions. I'll request a protective order, though I doubt it will deter whoever's behind this." Tricia nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down." "I know," Stein said, offering a faint smile. "But you need to be careful. These people play dirty, and they have resources." Later that week, Tricia attended a press conference organized by the civil rights group supporting her case. The room buzzed with energy as reporters set up cameras and microphones. Tricia took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping up to the podium. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm here today to shed light on an issue that affects countless individuals in our community. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern of bias and abuse that cannot be ignored." She spoke passionately about her encounter with Officer Lynch, the intimidation tactics, and the need for systemic change. The crowd listened intently, their faces a mix of anger and support. But as she stepped away from the podium, a man in the back of the room caught her eye. He was dressed in a suit, blending in with the crowd, but his piercing gaze sent a chill down her spine. He didn't clap or react. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. That evening, as Tricia reviewed the footage from the press conference, she noticed something unsettling. The man from the back of the room appeared in several shots, always watching her. She paused the video and zoomed in on his face, her stomach tightening with unease. Who was he? Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away. It was another message from an unknown number, "You're making things worse for yourself." Tricia's hands trembled as she set the phone down. She knew she was being watched, tracked, possibly even followed. The thought made her skin crawl, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. Anonymous calls at odd hours, cryptic messages, and the constant feeling of being followed took a toll on her. One night, as she drove home from a meeting, she noticed a car trailing her. She took several turns, trying to shake it, but the vehicle stayed with her, its headlights glowing ominously in her rearview mirror. Finally, she pulled into a gas station, hoping the crowded, well-lit area would deter whoever was following her. The car slowed but didn't stop, continuing down the road and disappearing into the night. Tricia exhaled shakily, gripping the steering wheel. The fear was real, but so was her determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, intimidated, or dismissed. The days blurred into a haze of meetings, interviews, and sleepless nights. The threats didn't stop, but neither did Tricia. She threw herself into her work, using every resource at her disposal to expose the corruption and bias that had infiltrated the police department. But as she delved deeper, she began to uncover things she wasn't prepared for, connections that hinted at a web of influence and power far larger than she had imagined. The realization both terrified and emboldened her. The fight was far from over, and Tricia knew the road ahead would only grow more dangerous. Tricia's resolve was unshakable, but the mounting pressure began to wear on her. She woke up each day to the weight of uncertainty, the fear that the next moment might bring another threat, another escalation. Her movements were calculated now, double-checking locks, watching for unfamiliar faces in her rearview mirror, and walking with her keys clutched tightly between her fingers. One morning, as she left her apartment, she found her tires slashed. The black rubber sagged lifelessly against the pavement. She stared at them for a moment, her breath fogging in the crisp morning air, before shaking her head and snapping a picture. It was the third time in 2 weeks. She didn't even bother calling the police this time, knowing the report would go nowhere. Instead, she called Maria. "This is insane, Tricia," Maria said when she arrived to pick her up. "You can't keep doing this alone." "I'm not alone," Tricia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have you. I have Stein. And I have the truth." Maria glanced at her, worry etched across her face. "The truth doesn't always protect you, you know." Tricia didn't respond. Later that day, Tricia sat in a dimly lit conference room at the Community Legal Aid Center. Stein had arranged for her to meet with a private investigator named Malcolm Reed, a gruff but sharp-eyed man who exuded competence. He placed a folder on the table between them and pushed it toward her. "I've been digging into Officer Lynch and his partner," Malcolm said, his voice low and steady. "There's more to their story than just bias. Lynch has a history, multiple complaints of excessive force, all swept under the rug." Tricia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. The deeper she read, the more her stomach churned. Lynch's file was littered with red flags, accusations of harassment, unreported stops, and ties to questionable figures in the department. "How does he still have a badge?" Tricia asked, incredulous. "Because he's protected," Malcolm said bluntly. "The department's a closed system. They protect their own, especially when those people are willing to do the dirty work." "And his partner?" "Clean record, but he's green. Probably stuck with Lynch because he's too scared to speak up." Tricia nodded, her mind racing. "So what do we do with this?" "We build a case," Malcolm said, leaning forward. "But you need to be careful. Lynch won't take this lying down, and the people shielding him won't either." That night, Tricia stayed late at the community center, poring over the documents Malcolm had given her. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the hum of the city outside a constant backdrop. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the figure standing in the hallway until a shadow stretched across her desk. She looked up, startled, to see a man in plain clothes watching her. "Ms. Newman," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I need to speak with you." Tricia's heart raced. "Who are you?" The man pulled out a badge and held it up briefly. "Detective Harris. We spoke before." She remembered him, the cryptic warnings, the smug demeanor. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm busy," she said curtly. "This won't take long." He stepped closer, his presence unnervingly casual. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." Tricia stared at him, her unease growing. "I'm fine." Harris tilted his head, studying her. "You're a brave woman, going up against the department like this. But bravery doesn't always pay off. Sometimes it gets people hurt." Her jaw tightened. "Is that a threat?" "Of course not," Harris said with a faint smile. Just advice. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her sitting in the cold glow of her desk lamp. The next day, Tricia met with a journalist named Claire Adams, who had been following her story closely. Claire was relentless, her notepad constantly in hand and her questions piercing. "You're not afraid this will escalate further?" Claire asked as they sat in a bustling cafe. "I'm terrified," Tricia admitted, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "But I can't let that stop me. If I back down, they win. And it's not just about me, it's about everyone they've hurt, everyone they've silenced." Claire nodded, scribbling notes. "Do you think the threats are coming from within the department?" "I don't think," Tricia said firmly. "I know." Claire looked at her, her expression both impressed and concerned. "You're taking on a dangerous fight, Tricia. But it's a fight worth taking." That evening, as Tricia walked to her car, she felt the familiar prickle of being watched. She scanned the parking lot, her eyes darting between the rows of vehicles. Then she saw him. A man in a dark hoodie stood near the edge of the lot, partially hidden behind a van. He was watching her, his posture tense. Tricia's heart pounded as she quickened her pace, unlocking her car and slipping inside. She locked the doors and started the engine, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The man didn't move, but his presence was enough to set her on edge. She drove home cautiously, checking her mirrors at every turn. The harassment escalated further when an envelope was slipped under her door. Inside was a photograph of her walking into the community center, taken from a distance. Scrawled across the back were the words, "We're always watching." Tricia sat on her couch, staring at the photo. The fear was suffocating, but so was the anger. They wanted her to feel powerless, to retreat. But she refused to give them that satisfaction. The following week, Malcolm uncovered another piece of the puzzle, a series of emails exchanged between Lynch and a higher-up in the department, discussing ways to handle Tricia's complaint. The language was vague but chilling, filled with implications of intimidation and retaliation. "This is it," Malcolm said during a late-night call. "This is the proof we need." Tricia felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that the danger wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. She forwarded the emails to Stein and Claire, knowing the exposure could put her at even greater risk. But she also knew it was necessary. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The tension in Tricia's life had grown to a boiling point. Every day felt like navigating a minefield, and the threats, both subtle and overt, were beginning to blur together. She had become hyper-aware of her surroundings, always checking her rearview mirror, always scanning unfamiliar faces in a crowd. Her world had shrunk into a constant state of vigilance, but she refused to relent. One morning, Tricia woke to the sound of her door buzzer. Groggy and wary, she glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, she saw two uniformed officers standing outside. Her stomach churned. She opened the door cautiously, the chain still latched. "Ms. Newman," one of them said. "We need you to come with us." "Why?" Tricia asked, her voice sharp. "We have a warrant," the officer replied, holding up a piece of paper. Tricia's mind raced. "A warrant for what?" "Suspicion of obstruction of justice," he said flatly. "Obstruction of justice?" The phrase sent a jolt of disbelief through her. This had to be a ploy, another attempt to intimidate her into silence. "I want to see the warrant," she said firmly, unlatching the chain but keeping her stance guarded. The officer handed it to her, but as her eyes scanned the document, she noticed discrepancies. The signature looked forged, and the language was vague, riddled with legal jargon meant to confuse rather than clarify. "This is a mistake," she said, handing it back. "Step aside, ma'am," the officer said, his tone shifting to one of authority. No, Tricia said, planting her feet. This is harassment, and I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer. The officers exchanged a glance. The tension was palpable, but before they could escalate the situation, Tricia's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. It was Malcolm. Put it on speaker, one of the officers ordered. Tricia ignored him, answering the call. Malcolm, there are 2 officers at my door claiming they have a warrant for my arrest. Do not go with them, Malcolm's voice came through, loud and clear. That warrant is likely fake. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The officers stiffened, and the one holding the warrant narrowed his eyes. You're obstructing, ma'am. No, you're fabricating, Tricia shot back, her fear giving way to anger. Leave, or I'll call internal affairs myself. Her defiance was met with a tense silence, but after a long moment, the officers turned and left without another word. Malcolm arrived shortly after, his expression grim. They're escalating, Tricia. This isn't just about intimidation anymore. They're trying to discredit you, make you out to be the problem. They won't stop until they break me, she said, her voice shaking with frustration. They won't break you, Malcolm said firmly. But you need to stay one step ahead. That evening, Tricia attended a meeting with Stein and Claire in a private room at the community center. The tension in the room was thick, the air buzzing with urgency. We're close, Stein said, spreading out documents across the table. Between the emails and Lynch's record, we have a solid case. But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks. Claire nodded, her pen flying across her notepad. I can push this story to the front page by tomorrow morning. But once it's out there, the backlash will be immediate. Are you ready for that? Tricia hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. I don't think I'll ever feel ready, she admitted. But this isn't just about me. It's about holding them accountable. The others nodded, their determination mirroring her own. The story broke the next day. The article was a scathing exposé, detailing Lynch's history of misconduct, the department's pattern of protecting him, and the intimidation tactics used against Tricia. It included anonymous testimonies from other victims, painting a damning picture of a system rotten to its core. The fallout was immediate. The department issued a public statement claiming the allegations were under review, but the tone was dismissive. Lynch was placed on administrative leave, but it was a hollow gesture, meant to pacify public outrage rather than enact real change. Tricia's phone rang non-stop, journalists seeking interviews, community members offering support, and, inevitably, the occasional anonymous threat. You're stirring the pot, Ms. Newman, one voice hissed through the receiver late one night. Be careful, or you'll get burned. Tricia slammed the phone down, her hands shaking. The fight was taking a toll, but she couldn't stop now. As the days passed, the harassment intensified. A brick was thrown through her window one evening, shattering glass across her living room. On it was a note scrawled in thick black marker, "Stay silent, or else." Tricia called the police, but when they arrived, their indifference was palpable. The officer taking her statement barely glanced at the note, muttering something about kids playing pranks. It's not a prank, Tricia said, her frustration boiling over. It's a threat. The officer shrugged. We'll file the report. As they left, Tricia felt more alone than ever. Despite the mounting threats, Tricia refused to retreat. She continued working with Malcolm, Stein, and Claire, gathering more evidence and rallying community support. Protests began to spring up, demanding accountability from the department. One afternoon, as Tricia spoke at a rally, she noticed a man standing at the edge of the crowd, watching her intently. His face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but there was something familiar about him. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, finishing her speech with a defiant call for justice. As the crowd erupted into applause, she scanned the area again, but the man was gone. Later that night, Tricia received a call from Maria. "Tricia, you need to see this," Maria said, her voice laced with urgency. "What is it?" "Someone leaked your address online. It's all over social media." Tricia's blood ran cold. She hung up and immediately checked her accounts. Sure enough, her personal information had been posted, along with hateful comments and veiled threats. Her phone buzzed with incoming messages, some supportive, but others venomous. One read, "We know where you live. You won't be safe for long." Tricia sank onto her couch, her chest tight with fear. The walls of her apartment felt suffocating, the shadows pressing in around her. Malcolm arranged for private security to watch over Tricia's apartment, but the sense of violation lingered. She felt the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension as Tricia Newman sat beside her lawyer, Malcolm. The trial against Officer Lynch and the police department had finally begun, months after her initial complaint. The media frenzy surrounding the case was palpable. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras and notepads poised to capture every detail. Tricia could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her every move, every expression. The opening arguments were intense. The prosecution painted a damning picture of systemic corruption, using Tricia's experience as the centerpiece of their case. The defense, however, was equally fierce, attempting to discredit Tricia at every turn. They portrayed her as a troublemaker, someone who sought attention rather than justice. Malcolm leaned over and whispered, "Remember, stay calm. They're going to try to rattle you." Tricia nodded, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every voice that had been silenced, every victim who had been ignored. The first day of testimony was grueling. Tricia took the stand, recounting the night of her initial encounter with Lynch in painstaking detail. Every word felt like walking a tightrope, knowing the defense would seize on any misstep. "Ms. Newman," the defense attorney began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you claim Officer Lynch singled you out because of some personal vendetta. Is it possible you're exaggerating the events of that evening?" Tricia met his gaze, her voice steady. "No, I'm not exaggerating. He targeted me because I stood up for accountability. And yet, there's no evidence of this alleged bias," the attorney pressed. "Could it be that you simply misunderstood his actions?" "I didn't misunderstand anything," Tricia replied firmly. "He used his position to intimidate me, and when that didn't work, he escalated." The attorney smirked, but Tricia refused to waver. Over the following days, witnesses took the stand. Stein testified about the pattern of misconduct within the department, presenting damning evidence of Lynch's record. Claire shared her investigative findings, highlighting the systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to persist. But it was the testimony of another officer, a whistleblower who had worked closely with Lynch, that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Officer Lynch made it clear that he didn't like people questioning his authority, the whistleblower said. He would brag about teaching lessons to anyone who stepped out of line. The defense scrambled to discredit the whistleblower, but the damage was done. The cracks in their case were becoming impossible to ignore. Outside the courtroom, the pressure was mounting. Protesters gathered daily, demanding justice not only for Tricia but for the countless others who had been wronged by a biased system. The police department issued a statement condemning the actions of a few bad apples, but the public wasn't buying it. Tricia, meanwhile, found herself under constant scrutiny. Her face was splashed across newspapers and TV screens, her name becoming a rallying cry for reform. While the support was overwhelming, so too were the threats. One evening, as Tricia walked to her car after court, she noticed a figure lingering near the parking lot. Her heart raced as she clutched her keys, ready to defend herself. "Ms. Newman," the man said, stepping into the light. It was Detective Harris, the officer who had warned her months ago. "What do you want?" Tricia asked, her voice cold. "I just came to say, be careful," he said, his tone unusually subdued. "There are people who don't want you to win this." "I already know that," she replied. Harris hesitated before turning and walking away, leaving Tricia with a gnawing sense of unease. As the trial progressed, the stakes grew higher. The defense introduced a surprise witness, one of Tricia's former co-workers from the community center. "Ms. Newman has always been outspoken," the co-worker testified. "Sometimes too outspoken. She doesn't always think about the consequences of her actions." It was a calculated move, designed to paint Tricia as reckless and impulsive. But Malcolm was ready. "Would you say Ms. Newman's actions have been harmful or disruptive?" he asked during cross-examination. The co-worker hesitated. "No, not harmful. Just passionate." "And would you agree that her passion is rooted in a desire to make things better for the community?" Malcolm pressed. "Yes," the co-worker admitted reluctantly. By the final day of the trial, both sides were exhausted. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful, emphasizing the need for accountability and the courage it took for Tricia to come forward. "Ms. Newman didn't ask for this fight," the prosecutor said. "But when faced with injustice, she chose to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who has been silenced by a corrupt system. This case isn't just about one officer, it's about the values we hold as a society." The defense, meanwhile, stuck to their strategy of casting doubt on Tricia's credibility. "This case is built on emotion and speculation," the defense attorney argued. "We cannot convict an officer based on subjective interpretations of his actions." The jury deliberated for hours, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Tricia sat in the courthouse hallway, her hands clasped tightly as Malcolm paced nearby. Finally, the courtroom doors opened, and everyone filed back inside. The jury foreperson stood, the verdict in their hands. Tricia held her breath as the foreperson began to read. The verdict, whatever it might be, would mark the end of one chapter in Tricia's fight but the beginning of another. The journey had tested her in ways she never imagined, but it had also revealed her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to justice. And as the foreperson's words echoed through the courtroom, Tricia braced herself for what was to come, ready to continue the fight for accountability and change. Subscribe, comment, and like for more interesting stories.